Welcome back to the workshop, everybody. Today we have one of the most legendary builds I have ever done. It is a custom sword build with an experimental brand new Damascus pattern that I came up with. Now to me, twist Damascus is really cool and it can have a lot of really cool applications, especially when combined with other patterns or when you're doing something like twisted mosaic. It kind of gets overdone quite a bit. So with a couple specific techniques that I worked out, I figured out a way to elevate twist Damascus to something that looks really, really cool. And I'm gonna be forging an entire sword out of this pattern. Specifically, I am building a two-handed leaf-shaped longsword. The handle's gonna be tricked out with a bunch of beautiful, comfortable, and very functional fittings. I'm just super excited for this project, so let's get in the shop, weld up a billet, and throw it in the forge. This pattern requires a lot of steps and planning, so it's very important that I get this initial stack up perfect. I start off by stacking 1084 and 15 and 20 in 30 layers of a very specific configuration that's going to come into play down the line. This pattern has a lot of different steps, and each one has to be executed perfectly for the pattern to turn out how I want it to look. The very first stack here is actually one of, if not the most important step of the entire process to get right, because while it's true that we're starting out with 30 layers for a pattern that's going to end up having over 2,000 layers, this is the initial building block that's going to allow the rest of the pattern to take shape. Here's an end cut of what the pattern looks like right now. Now it's a little lopsided because it was an end cut, but this is exactly what we're going for, kind of radiating layers out from that core of 15 and 20. So now we are cleaning off each layer and stacking it up and getting it back in the forge to forge it out once again. This sword project is a custom order, meaning that somebody reached out and they commissioned me to make the piece in the first place. And they had a very unique request. They saw a knife that I made a while ago with that accidental experimental Damascus pattern that I'm making here and really liked it. They requested that I make an entire sword from this pattern. Now, this is not only a challenge because I didn't really remember how I made the pattern in the first place, but also because in any type of art, intention is extremely important, and I don't like just throwing a mystery pattern on a sword and hoping it looks good. So I had to do some mental gymnastics and imagine exactly what this pattern would look like on a sword. And after all of the thinking and sketching and mocking up of this pattern that I did, I came to one very scientific conclusion, which was that this pattern would look super cool on a sword. Here's my super sophisticated way of twisting the Damascus, welding a pipe wrench to a bar, clamping it in the press, and twisting it by hand. This method requires multiple cycles of heating it up, twisting it, and cleaning it off in between, and I'm really watching for the twist rate to be exactly uniform all the way throughout the bar, so that when I cut it in half and stack it up on itself, both sides of the sword have the same pattern density. Alright folks, so I just spent probably about 45 minutes doing all the math to make sure that this pattern will come together properly, because after all, this is an experimental pattern. I've only done it once before and it was by accident, and it turned out really, really nice. Now I did reverse engineer how I made it, I think pretty accurately. It was weird. It was kind of a conglomeration of several different patterns that you would never put together in this way. In fact, I've literally never seen anybody do this with these types of patterns, because it intentionally takes away some of the uniformity that you'd see in a twist pattern, but it replaces it with beautiful chaos. That is really what I'm going for here. Lots of drama and lots of swirling, flamey looking designs in the pattern. Here we have our 16-inch bar of twisted W's, and I have cleaned off one side. I have forged it into a 1 1/4 by 0.66 inch thick bar, and so I'm going to cut this in half, but I have another piece of W's that I forged out over there that is 10 layers of stacked W's, which is I believe what I used in the original one, is going to be the center bar here, and that will reduce to about 0.03 of an inch, with the final blade dimensions being forged to a 1/4 inch thick. I will need roughly 12 cubic inches to make this, and I have about 14.5 cubic inches once these pieces are all surface ground and welded together. Lots of math. All you need to know is that this should work just fine, and I'm very excited. So let's cut this in half, surface grind that thing when it cools down, slap them back together, and forge the sword. Ha, this is spooky, 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 scary, spooky. Now it may seem like this pattern is just a glorified Sanmai, but the thing that sets it apart from Sanmai is the purpose of the stacking. In Sanmai, the purpose of stacking up the layers is to expose the core as the edge bar for aesthetic reasons or structural reasons, but in this case the core is not being put there to be exposed as the edge bar, it is actually there as a shim. With Twist Damascus, the goal is often to get the core of the steel onto the outside of the knife, which usually requires you to grind off 2/3 of the material, 1/3 off each side, to get to that good core pattern. Now grinding tons of steel off of a beautiful pattern is never a fun thing to do, and it is also very wasteful, so the goal of this pattern is to display that beautiful core activity on both sides of the sword without having to grind off so much steel or hide the best parts of the pattern in the core of the blade. Now that all the forging of the blade is done and it has been thermal cycled, which means normalized and annealed to re-establish our spheroidized grain structure, now comes probably my least favorite part of the entire process, which is surface grinding, profiling, and rough grinding our bevels and fuller in preparation for heat treat. What just burned? What just burned? Your joke. Something just burned. I actually just had to replace the motor on my dust collection system after it burned out, so I was afraid that it had happened again, but luckily it was just the on switch. So I replaced that and got back to grinding. Alright folks, after some careful grinding and lots of layout lines and math to make sure the fuller depth and width is perfect, we have this thing rough ground and ready for heat treat. So once again, we're gonna go to Iowa and use my buddy Carver's kiln to heat treat this thing perfectly. I did do a very light test etch, very difficult to see to the camera, but it looks insane, and that is the goal with this pattern, to make it look absolutely crazy. The customer said he wanted it to look like chaotic dragon fire, so we're really gonna go for that here. We have this beautiful repeating twist column going down, surrounded by swirling flames and lots of fine aggressive lines. So now let's jump in the truck and drive 5.5 hours into the forests of Iowa. I'll see you when I get there. Here we are back in Iowa. in Carver's shop. Carver, say hello.
Hello.
And we are going to be heat treating this sword in his big kiln. As you saw in the last video, I have just applied a coat of anti-scaling solution on the ricasso, inside of the fuller, and on the edges of the blade, as you can see. So let's get it in the kiln and get this thing quenched. All right, folks, here we go. Oil is heated up to about 135 degrees. This guy's been soaking in there for roughly 15 minutes. Let's do it. Good vapor jacket dissipation, about 3.5–4 seconds, which is what we're looking for. We'll hold it in there for probably another 15 seconds. Fast forward. And bada bing, folks. So I'm gonna let that cool down all the way and get it into the temper as soon as possible. He does not have two kilns here, so I cannot snap temper this thing immediately, so we're gonna have to wait for this thing to cool down. It should be pretty quick because it is a vertical kiln, so all the heat is just dissipating vertically pretty quickly. But I will see you guys after it is tempered. All right, folks, we are back in my shop. The sword has been heat treated and tempered. Now what we have to do is surface grind it, so straighten it and get all of the surfaces back up to a 400 grit finish. I'm also going to grind in the distal taper on this blade because it's going to have a pretty pronounced distal taper. I'm gonna end up doing a fuller that goes all the way to about right here, and then I'm gonna hollow grind the edges with my 72-inch radius platen just to give a slight concave to remove just a little bit more material and give us a nice fine edge. It's actually really straight this way, but the blade actually sabered on us just a little bit. As you can see, the tip has kicked off to this side by about 1/8 of an inch. But that is okay because I accounted for that happening. I left the tip about 3/16 of an inch wide and a little bit longer than we need, about 1/2 inch longer than we need, just to account for any crazy sabering that might have happened. So I'm gonna jump back in with you guys after this thing is straightened and when it's time to surface grind it. And here we are, post surface grinding. I don't know why I said I'd come back when I was ready to surface grind. What I meant was I will come back when I'm ready to grind the fuller, which I am now. I have surface ground this way, gotten the distal taper roughed in. It is actually symmetrical now. The tip is centered and the curvature is identical on both sides. So now it is time to grind this fuller. Gonna be doing that on my fullering attachment from Broadbeck Ironworks. A very good respite from the other fullering wheel in the last video. If you haven't seen that one, go watch it. That makes this look like, well, a piece of cake. It's time to enjoy this other fullering wheel here and grind this fuller. After this fuller is ground, it's gonna expose some really cool patterns. So I'm gonna have some self-control and not run to the ferrochloride and test etch this thing. We'll see if I'm capable of holding off. Time to grind. After finish grinding the fuller and the bevels, I move over to a slack belt on my other grinder to establish the convexed edge. That's going to allow this edge to be extremely stable while still being quite thin. Performance is first and foremost the most important thing that I take into account when making any knife or sword, despite how close to an art knife it may be in classification. The sword is finished ground. It is looking fantastic. I test etched it. Am I gonna show you the pattern yet? No, you'll have to wait till the end. It's ridiculous. The pattern is ridiculous. I'm extremely happy with it. It is hands down the coolest pattern I've ever made on a sword. One of my large goals when making new patterns is for it to be very confusing and hard for people to understand how I did it. Obviously, you all know exactly how I did it, but I think I achieved that effect. If I didn't know how this was made and I was looking at it, honestly, I don't think I could reverse engineer this. I mean, it's just very unique. There's so much activity going on. You have these beautiful, symmetrical, repeating squiggles. But yeah, so plunge lines down here are close enough to where I can start to hand sand them and finish them. They are really close, those radius plunge grinds. Fullers are mint, spearmint, if if you will. Sword mint, even. So now that this sword is finished ground and straight and beautiful and slicey and stabby, I am going to start on the fittings. The first thing that I'm going to do is forge the guard. Now, as I do with everything, I cut out a very precise paper stencil of what the guard is going to look like this way. The reason I'm making this guard so narrow down is because the customer really wants this sword to be maneuverable and lively in the hand, even though it is technically a two-handed broadsword with a nearly 30-inch blade, and it's just over 1 3/4 inches, 11 inches from the tip. Very wide blade. He wants it to be very rigid as well, so that's why I left it a bit thicker. I don't want it to be a whippy blade. I want it to be nice and rigid and hold up to a lot of abuse. Not that you're going to be abusing this sword. Right? I'm watching you. You know who you are. But it's time to head out to the forge, trace this paper stencil. Trace the paper stencil onto the anvil and forge out this big old piece of stainless steel into this guard. The reason that I'm using stainless steel for the guard and the pommel on this piece is because corrosion resistance is of the utmost importance to the buyer, and also I've just kind of moved to using stainless steel on most of my fittings, even when I could use mild steel or low carbon alloys, because when you're wielding a sword, or even if it's a collector piece, you don't want to have to oil the part that you're holding, right? So having the guard and pommel made from stainless steel alleviates a lot of that maintenance that goes into keeping a sword corrosion free. It is a bit more tricky to forge and machine than mild steel, but it's really not that big of a deal. So let's get out to the forge and smash this block into a guard. The goal when forging out fittings like a guard or pommel is to get them pretty close to the profile, not too close though, while keeping them an even thickness on the faces. This is because I'm going to clean off the faces and use those as flat surfaces to index all of the rest of the measurements for the guard and make it super easy and precise to chuck it up in the mill when I'm milling the slots. Now that we have the guard completely fit up to the sword, it is fit up very tightly in there. There's no light coming through. It looks fantastic. I am now going to sculpt the guard just roughly to about 220 grit, nothing insane, but around final dimensions of where we're going to be, so that I can move on to the spacers and have all of the alignment and the final measurements already there on the guard to use as a reference point for everything else on the handle. And I'm going to scribe out a grid and grind this thing to its completed dimensions. The reason that I like to scribe grids on every single fitting before shaping them, regardless of the final shaping that I'm going to do, is because the grids are always based on the two independent variables that are the profile of the blade and then the flat of the ricasso. So regardless of how I shape it, I can always reference that grid line and make sure everything is symmetrical both side to side on the guard itself and oriented to the blade. And because I use the same independent variables to lay out the grids on all of the fittings, I can also ensure that they are all aligned with each other. The guard is now structurally complete. I'm going to do some fine tuning on it later, but for now we're good to move on to the top spacer. I'm using a simple jig that you guys have seen me use before to grind radiuses into different fittings. Now this one's a bit different because the radius of the sides have to blend into the radius of the ends, and they are both a little bit different. This requires me to move the jig around a lot and then do all of the finishing by hand on a slack belt. The bottom radius of the spacer is now hand sanded up to 600 grit, so I move over to a slack belt to rough in the chamfers around the tops of the spacer. This is kind of a stylistic element that I've developed over the past few years, and plus I really like the way it looks in mirroring the shape of the pommel, how it flares outwards in a concave and then domes over at the top with a convex. I really like including geometric congruence in all of the fittings, so if one fitting has a unique shape or flow, another fitting must also have that unique shape to kind of mirror it and tie it all together. After slotting the piece of walnut for the upper handle segment, I move on to bedding it to the tang. I use some toughened epoxy, coat the inside, and then fit it onto the tang that's lightly coated in wax. Once the epoxy sets up, I can then pull it off of the tang, and this does a few things. It actually reinforces the inside of that slot, it creates an airtight seal once you put the fitting on, and it also ensures that the fitting goes on the same way every single time. The middle spacer is now finished up to a 600 grit finish, so I can slot and bed the bottom handle segment that's going to be wrapped in wire. And because that middle spacer is done, I can scribe on the perimeter of that and the upper spacer onto the upper handle segment and start to shape it on the grinder. The pommel's going to end up being what's called a scent stopper pommel, meaning it's perfectly round and flares out towards the end. But I can't have it be perfectly round right now. I need those flats still established so that I can chuck it up in the mill and mill the complicated slot for the tang. Alright, very exciting stuff. We got the pommel fully slotted onto the tang. Now this is a very tricky process and it took an entire day just to slot up the pommel and get it prepped for a pommel nut. The reason being, it is the smallest point of contact on the entire handle in terms of cross section, but it's the deepest. And it has to end at a certain point and transition to a round rod that then goes through where the pommel nut screws onto. So lots of finicky stuff. Unfortunately on that day, my camera died in the middle of actually milling out and fitting up the pommel, but I assure you it's not very exciting footage. It's just me walking back and forth from the vise to the table to the mill many times over again. So on to the pommel nut. I'm just going to show you what we got going on. Here's the pommel. The pommel is still in its forged state with the flattened side, so I could use those to index while milling and drilling. I've drilled a hole through there, and this on the end is not the actual pommel nut. This is an extra pommel nut that I had laying around from another sword that had roughly the same dimensions, because I like to keep the outer diameter of the inner barrel of the pommel nut pretty much the same on everything, because I use 1/4 20 NC threading on most stuff because it's nice and thick and bulky and I don't have to make that threaded section too small. And so I can just use this pommel nut that I messed up a long time ago, kind of test fit a lot of different swords that have that threading. And so now let's move on to the actual pommel nut that I forged from some stainless steel. Now making this pommel nut would be a lot easier if I had a lathe, but I do not have a lathe, so I have to do all of the shaping on the grinder and by using my mill and my drill press to shape the outside of the pommel nut so that it is round and straight in relation to the inner hole that I'm going to tap and thread onto the end of the tang. If it's not perfectly straight, you're going to have a lopsided pommel nut that's going to contact the inside hole of that pommel over and over again every time you turn it, making it impossible to create a perfectly straight and centered pommel nut. After the pommel nut is structurally done, we can finally move on to finish sculpting the pommel. This is a very tricky process and I have to really watch out for my scribe lines to make sure that it's perfectly round in orientation to the blade itself and that central hole. Alright folks, now it is time to do a little bit of testing on this thing to make sure that the balance point is exactly where I need it to be. After doing the final shaping on the pommel, I can very easily use it with one hand. But a really good way to actually test out a sword like this, and a really good medium that I've found, is mulch. You would think that mulch is just super soft, but because it is so many interlocking sticks and pretty substantial sized pieces of wood, it stops the sword very, very nicely. Somewhat similar to an opponent, you could say. It is just a really, really nice target to practice on because it's not gonna go all the way through it really easily. And also, if your edge alignment is off, you'll get punished for it pretty quickly. So I'm gonna do just some basic one and two-handed testing on this pile of mulch to see how I like the handling of this sword. Now, obviously the handle's not even close to finished, but it is structurally complete. And as you can see, I got plenty of room for one hand, just enough room for another hand. So it's just on the two-hand end of hand and a half in terms of classification. I like that a lot. And two-handed. All right. It feels great in the hand. It feels very lively. It has great rebound. It's easy to strike and retreat. Now, obviously, kind of awkward doing it on a pile of mulch. That's a little bit lower set. I will say I'm very happy with that. Now let's move on to the more brutal testing, the 2x4 test. Now this is a dry, extremely hard 2x4 here. Let me reiterate, swords are not meant to chop wood. They're not meant to cut down trees. They're not meant to cut up firewood. Swords are meant for sword on sword bladed combat and soft targets. They're not meant for chopping into wood. That being said, I want to make sure that this is as high a quality sword as I can possibly make, and that it can take all the abuse that you could give to a sword under regular circumstances. So we're gonna start off with a few lighter chops, then we're gonna really get going and see what kind of damage we can do to this. Now granted, this is not sharpened yet. Keep that in mind. We're gonna try some very, very basic ordering towards inward strokes, one-handed. See how they do. You can hear that ring. That tells you that it is homogeneous from the pommel to the tip of the blade, and there are no disconnection points. I'm gonna cut this side. That cut very nicely. The rebound feels great. There's not a lot of vibration in the hand. The point of percussion is damn near perfect. That just feels great. I'm swinging pretty dang hard. A couple stabs here. Overall, my first impression of this sword, it is an absolutely fun sword to use. It is a devastating slicer because of that big belly and all that mass right here. Now the preliminary strength tests are done, I'm going to move on to finishing this handle. So let's get back in the shop and prep these handle segments for wrapping. This is a wire wrapping jig that I came up with, and I made it with a two-way ratchet and some wood and all thread. Very simple, but it allows me to apply a ton of pressure while I'm wire wrapping things. And because I'm applying all that pressure with my fingers and the twisted wire, I need to put some layers of tape on my fingers so it doesn't absolutely shred up my skin. As I'm wrapping this handle, I continuously tuck the wire against itself so it's really tightly wrapped and there's no gaps. I also continuously apply a toughened CA glue underneath the wire so it holds it in place really well as I'm wrapping it because it dries quite quickly. Now, because the bottom of this segment of the handle is perfectly round and it flares out towards the top, it makes terminating the wires on the top a bit more tricky, meaning that the termination points of the wires on the larger end of the handle won't be equidistant like they are on the bottom. But if you do it very carefully, it should look quite nice anyways. Putting complex risers underneath a leather-wrapped handle is a concept I've been playing around with for a while, and I decided to get quite ambitious with this one and do more complex risers on this than I ever have on any project before. This is a very meticulous process that relies heavily on order of events. You have to glue the leather to the risers in an extremely secure way while keeping the leather malleable and using a glue that stays tacky after drying. Right now the leather is quite damp and there's glue on the handle and the leather, so I'm just forming it pretty tightly to the handle, centering the seam in preparation for stitching. For the majority of this process, the stitches look quite messy and loose. That's because after I'm done stitching, I go back and tighten each one individually to make sure that the seam is completely closed, I have no loose stitches, and that they are all aligned properly. Alright folks, so I clamped this leather handle segment in some of my Kydex forming foam overnight with one layer of paper towel and then some electrical tape, and that has done a pretty okay job of forming that leather to those risers. It looks pretty fantastic. Now, the reason I did electrical tape is because I did not want this thing to dry out fully, because today I'm going to be using small wooden tools to go in there and basically burnish and sculpt out all of these risers so they look a lot better, a lot more crispy. Here is an example. This was a test piece that I did for a different handle, an example of kind of how crispy I'm going for here. Now obviously these risers are much wider, but that is kind of a good example of what these will look like. So they're gonna be really crispy, they're gonna pop a bunch. That stitching came out great. I'm gonna do a little bit of cleaning up and burnishing on that as well. Gotta clip off the extra on the top and the bottom and then get to burnishing this thing. Again, I do want it to be slightly damp as it is right now because that makes the burnishing and molding process a little bit easier, actually quite a bit easier. Cool thing about the glue that I used, which is leather weld. The way that I apply leather weld is I put a pretty generous coat on the handle itself, the wooden core with the risers, and then I used a paintbrush to really even it out. I don't want any big globs, especially up against a riser. I don't want any buildup. I want a nice even coverage of it everywhere. And then I put another thinner coat on the inside of the leather before I wrapped it. So let's get some tools made up to burnish this leather into those beautiful risers. After tooling and dyeing this piece, here is our final product. I am so happy with how this turned out. All the risers pop really nicely. The low spots are all rock solid and that stitching is very nice and straight. The next step with this is going to be using this stuff right here, Pro Resist, to coat this so it is completely watertight and has a nice gloss to it. So while I wait for that to fully dry, I'm going to start doing finishing touches on the blade. Very exciting. We're getting very close to the end here. There's a couple fine-tuning things I need to do to the blade to get it ready for hand sanding. Now the pommel and the guard are done. I'll make you wait to see those. Oh my gosh, they look amazing. So yeah, the last step is gonna be taking this thing over to the grinder, deepening out the fuller right here. I wanna remove just a few more grams from this blade before hand sanding. Hand sanding itself will remove some weight, but I wanna spot reduce some weight between here and here, just to make it a little bit lighter. Let's get on over to the grinder, lighten this thing up just a little bit more. In order to dial in the fuller perfectly, I need to take depth measurements and thickness measurements all the way down the blade and mark them out clearly so that I can make sure that the fuller depth on each side is exactly the same down to 1/1000th of an inch, and also make sure that the taper of the thickness between the fullers is even all the way down. And now it's time to hand sand the blade. Making Damascus swords and applying my mirror polished Damascus finish to them is always a challenge because it means bringing the entire sword all the way up to an even 1500 grit before etching and a true 3000 grit finish after etching. And so this entire hand sanding process takes quite a while, so enjoy the hand sanding montage. So we got this side up to 1000 grit. Now it's time for the other side. I am done hand sanding the sword. It is up to 1500 grit. I also hand sanded the choils on the side, so technically it is now ready to etch. However, I have learned in the past that it is a good idea to make the scabbard before you etch the blade, because in the scabbard making process, you are putting the sword in and out of the scabbard many times, and occasionally there can be little bits of dust or grit or whatever that get in the scabbard during the making process that can scratch up the blade. If it's finally etched, that just is a huge bummer and you're gonna have to re-etch the entire thing. So I have learned that it's best just to make the scabbard when the sword is almost done but not etched, to save you that hassle and headache in the future. So you then have a chance to clean out the scabbard, get it all looking pristine, test fit the sword, even form the scabbard to the sword without messing up the etch. So that being said, I would like to show you what the sword looks like. Now keep in mind, it is not etched and the pommel nut is protruding a little bit because it is not finished. But without further ado, I present to you a preview of the sword. It looks absolutely fantastic. It feels very light in one hand. I don't have any issues rebounding, even downwards rebounds, which are the hardest ones to do. It is so comfortable. And look at this handle. We have those beautiful dark bronze stainless steel guard and pommel. I kept kind of a matte shine on the middle and the top spacer, and then the top of the top spacer has a mirror polished accent on it to really make it pop. You can see that leather wrapped handle segment. That's dark brown. It looks black in this lighting with those risers that came out so nicely. I just put a coat of Resolene over it to make it completely waterproof and a lot tougher and stronger on the outside. That also helps to protect the stitching from fraying in the future. And you can see that beautiful wire wrapped handle segment. The fit up of everything is so nice and tight. It feels amazing in the hand. Very pleased with how this is turning out. Right now I'm gonna package this thing up and send it down to my leather worker to have the scabbard made. Now the customer wanted an all leather scabbard that has been dipped in hardening wax, paraffin wax essentially, and that hardens when it cools. It's lightweight, it's tough, it's beautiful, and I think it's gonna look wonderful with this sword. So I'm gonna jump back in with you guys when the scabbard is finished. Now that we have the scabbard done and the sword back in the shop, it's time to do the final steps of this sword build, and that is number 1, finishing the pommel nut. Number 2, etching the blade. Now etching the blade is an entire day ordeal because instead of like a normal knife about this size, taking a pretty long time frankly to hand sand in between cycles and get up to a 3000 grit finish and then buff and then clean off with a toothbrush and then coffee etch and then polish after coffee etching and then carnauba wax coat, all those steps on a knife about this size would take about 6 hours. On a sword this size, that now turns into about 15 hours. Ooh! Ooh! Woo! Wake up! Wake up! Oh! Wake up!
Wake up, Buster Brown. I got the pricklies all over my body. My hair is standing up on end, mate. Savvy?
Talk about a momentary adrenaline dump. Good Lord. Now, I know you all are not aware, but I have a curse. A curse that is completely self-inflicted. If a project is going too perfectly, I will always have an extremely annoying unforced error. Only one with large project. No matter how clear the finish line is in front of me, I will find a way to mess something up at the last moment. And it's never something major that I need to like redo everything. It's just something that's really, really annoying. For example, catching something in the buffing wheel after doing a final buff before assembly, and it flings off and bing, 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 flies all over the concrete. Or dropping a finished and hand-sanded bolster on the ground, on the concrete. That is why I have rubber mats all around that entire workstation, because I know that the little demon in my wrists and hands will cause me to drop something. That's the curse. And that curse almost just really, really got me there. That hasn't happened yet on this project, so stay tuned. If you made it this far in the video, genuinely thank you for watching. This turned out to be one of my favorite swords I've ever made, both functionally and aesthetically. And finally, after hundreds of hours of work, I present to you Longyen, Flame of the Dragon. Alright guys, the sword is completely finished along with the scabbard, the suspension ring, and the scabbard actually has two rings on the back that allow you to attach a shoulder strap to it. And this scabbard is wax hardened, so it is extremely hard and rigid, and that dragon looks absolutely beautiful. It goes well with the name of this piece, because the name of this sword is Longyen, which means Flame of the Dragon. The gold and the black on the scabbard go perfectly with the gold and the black on the handle. That dark patinaed bronze look look of the stainless steel guard pommel and pommel nut came out beautifully. I really like that touch. I'm especially happy about the complex riser pattern that I did on that leather wrap section of the handle. The two spacers with that flash of silver in the handle come out beautifully, especially with the mirror polished facet on the top spacer. Balance point of this sword is just about 4 inches above the guard, which is excellent for a two-handed broadsword, essentially is what this turned out to be. And just look at that mirror polished Damascus pattern. I really like how there's matching squiggles on either side, just kind of flares of silver in that pattern with chaotic flames in between. And you get the look of some mosaic patterns, how it repeats over and over down the blade, except it's not mosaic. That experimental method with the twist Damascus really allows you to show so much more of that activity on each side, so it's not split up. You don't have to grind a ton of material off, and it just allows you to get so much more activity out of that beautiful twisted mosaic Damascus. That scent stopper pommel is the perfect counterweight. It feels very lively in the hand, can easily be used with one hand or two hands for very powerful slashes, and as we saw in the testing segment, it is extremely strong. Just overall, guys, I am so happy with how this piece came out. But as always, I want to know what you guys think of this sword, so leave it in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this far. I put a ton of effort into making these blades and these videos, so if you did in fact like the video, drop a like, and if you want to see me make more cool stuff just like this, be sure to follow my page. It's going to be one heck of a journey, and we got some really cool projects coming up. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Hwah!